Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to draw different fur lengths in graphite. Now for this recent Spaniel drawing that I've completed, the variation in fur lengths here are going to massively help with the level of realism that is achieved. Now before I cover more of those tips for the fur, I do want to first of all begin with the eye. Now this is where I begin all of my portraits in any medium that I'm working in, because this is where the main emotion stems from. Now spaniels are very expressive, so I do want to make sure that I've captured as much of that in the portrait as possible. Now the eye shape, the size of the eye is going to affect that expression, so making sure that I haven't just come straight in with a round circle, I want to be making sure that I've maybe sloped more of a diagonal edge, that I've captured all of those subtle shadows, all of which are going to help with that character expression and the way that that emotion is being captured in the drawing. Now onto the fur, and my first tip here is to establish a good base foundation. Now when I start working with my graphite pencils, you can see that this looks quite sketchy at this moment. There's no real definition in the lines that I'm creating. And that's because my first goal here is to capture softness. Now once I've established that, first of all using graphite powder as my first layer, and then coming in with my graphite pencils, the softness is achieved in stages, and I don't want to be jumping into those top details first of all. I do want to be saving those for later on in that layering process. Now the length of the fur here is going to be determined by how long that pencil is in contact with the surface. Now in some situations, depending on the size of the drawing, you may only need a line that is barely 1 or 2 millimeters long. In some situations where the fur is very short, it's more about shading to capture that impression of fur that is either coming towards you directly to the camera, or as I said, exceptionally short that you can't see any length of that fur at all. And then within a split second in some cases, the area directly next to it, such as here above the eye, that fur then gets significantly longer compared to something that is beside it. Now the fur below the eye is much shorter than what is currently being drawn at the moment. Making sure that I've got that variation is also going to help maximise that level of realism here. What I don't want to do is just continue with one set of techniques and then use that throughout. I do want to make sure that I've got as much of the natural look of that fur in the drawing, and that variety is crucial. Now one thing here just relating to the eyes, because this was a side photo, the eyes are a very different shape. They are also different sizes. Capturing that variety there as well is going to help keep those proportions and that perspective accurate to the reference photo. So this is my base layer established with graphite powder, and you can see that the softness that's being created fairly easily here. Now you can do this with graphite pencils if you don't want to use graphite powder, but you will have to spend a lot longer in order to get this level of softness and use more blending tools in order to soften those layers as you go. It is something that can be done, but it does, as I say, take significantly longer, and you do want to incorporate that additional time in that process. Now when I start building in these details here, my first priority is just to establish the fur direction. I'm not focusing necessarily on my contrast as such. That's going to be enhanced as I start to build in my darker layers, as you can see here. Now one aspect that I do focus on throughout all of the real-time tutorials is how to get that balance right between graphite pencil use and the erasers as well. I personally like to use my erasers throughout the middle stage of that layering process, not just for my top bright highlights. It may be that you need to come back in with your erasers partway through, and then you actually need to darken those highlights and then come back in with the erasers. But of course this is going to depend on the reference photo, the lighting, the fur texture, and so on. Now along with the fur length, the fur direction here is really important as well. Getting this balance right is going to also maximise that level of realism. Now just like when we draw the same length of pencil strokes, if all of the pencil strokes we create are travelling in the same direction, they're quite flat, they don't have much curve to it, there is not as much of that natural look, then that is going to then make the portrait look flat. Now the area here, when I start working on the section around the nose, the fur direction is going to change fairly quickly, and that's because it's curving over a structure under the skin. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. And if, for example, my pencil strokes were too short, they were too long, and they were too straight, then all of that is going to impact how natural that portrait looks. What we can end up doing as well is adding additional structures under the skin, little bumps, some lumps that may not actually be there, and eventually the structure of the face will begin to change. Now, if we're aiming for a high level of realism and we are having pet portrait commissions to order, then this is clearly something that we do need to make sure we get right. We don't want to be adjusting any part of the face structure because it's not going to resemble that person's pet in the way that it should. So making sure that the fur direction, the fur length is accurate is something that I do pay a considerable amount of time and attention to. Now another aspect there is the placement of the highlights and shadows. And again, this does also relate to the length of the pencil strokes. Now if we make our pencil strokes too short or too long, eventually that light or dark area will gradually get shifted from one place to the other. So for example, as I start to build in this fur around the nose, if I was to accidentally then put these highlights and shadows a little bit further over to the left or the right and make my pencil strokes too long, this section of the face is going to look too fluffy, the fur texture will change fairly quickly, and as I say, those light and dark placements are going to also move. Now when I start to establish more of these darker areas here, some of these are markings on her muzzle. I want to be making sure that again I've got those accurate. Those markings are very unique to each individual dog. But building up my values here in stages just means I can judge and assess all of that gradually. Now what I never do personally is I don't work with my darkest graphite pencil first. You'll see here that it's always been a gradual layering process, and really only at this stage here do I start to begin mapping in my darkest values. Now I find working with this layering process very much maximises the level of depth because the softness, going back to my base layer that I always want to capture, is going to be enhanced with more of these layers that I add. If I start with a base foundation and then jump directly into my darkest details and my brightest highlights, I've missed out on all of that crucial mid-tone stage. And that I feel makes a big difference to that level of softness. Now when aiming for this level of realism, there are a lot of things to consider. How much pressure to apply to the pencil, how to move and hold the pencil, how we should be working with that layering process, at what point do we start putting in our highlights and shadows, and so on. And because of that, I do like to record all of my real-time tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing. So I'm able to explain everything in the moment. Now what this enables me to do is, if I do make a slight adjustment to how I'm using the pencil, for example, or why I approach a layering process in a specific way, I can mention all of that in that exact time of that drawing process. Now which I feel then makes even the most complex subjects easier to tackle. If any of my real-time lessons, including this Spaniel, is of interest, then I'll link all of the information to those tutorials in the description below. Now I do have a separate little focus tutorial here on YouTube that shows this process of the ear, and I've packed lots of tips into that on how to draw realistic Spaniel ears. So if that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below as well. Now onto the chest part of this portrait, and this is where the fur texture does change fairly considerably. Now the length of the fur is also far longer, so I need to be making sure that I am adjusting the techniques so that I have got that variation in texture accurate. Now again here, just like elsewhere on this portrait, I have used graphite powder for my base layer. However, one key difference is here that I haven't added it everywhere. I have actually allowed a lot more of the white of the paper to show through on this portion of the portrait, given how light the fur was. Now when I do start working with my graphite pencils, you'll see that I'm using more of a cautious layering approach because this fur is that much softer. Now if the dog had much more of a darker marking, a stronger shadow on the chest, then of course I can be more bold with the pencils that I'm using, and I could go much darker with my graphite powder. But where I'm trying to capture this level of realism, the variation of those highlights, how bright it should be, how dark the shadows should be, is something that I do want to focus on. Now, when working on smaller areas like this, it can be a little bit tempting to get too fixated on that one area, and we forget then to look at other sections we've already drawn. Now, one thing I mean by that specifically is if we're working with the darker values on this area of the portrait, we might then be more tempted to go too dark because we know we're drawing a shadow. Whereas one tip that I would always recommend with any drawing, any medium, is to judge how light that highlight should be in relation to a highlight that's already been established in that drawing, and also compare that in your reference photo. If, for example, the reflection in the eye is the brightest part of that drawing, then you know that the white fur elsewhere doesn't need to be as light as that. So even though we know the fur is white, usually there's still going to be a degree of graphite there in place to tone it down. Usually the white of the eye, that bright highlight, if it's visible, is going to be one of the brightest parts of any portrait. Now here, as I begin to build up more of that graphite powder, I do want the lower edge of this portrait to be faded into the white of the paper. I personally don't like there to be too much of a harsh edge here. I feel like it creates too much of that harsh difference between that paper and the subject. So being able to blend that last lower section, I feel again helps with that level of realism. Now, one other aspect that is important here is, especially with the length of the fur where it gets longer, is what fur is overlapping another section. So at this stage, because I had now finished the chest fur, that was done, and underneath the ears, I have to come back in and add those finer details on the edges, so this now makes it look like that ear is sat in front. This again is another aspect that's going to massively enhance that level of realism. And this is going to be determined by how long that fur should be. Even if the fur is very short, there may still be a few little details that overlap a specific section, but you don't want to overdo it to make them look more visible if it's not what that fur length should be. So making sure that we are also adjusting the pencil strokes for those details is really important. And with that in mind, because the whiskers do overlap everything else completely, I always leave those for my last layers. If the whiskers are added in too soon, and then we need to come back in and adjust the layers of fur underneath, we have to work around them, and it is really fiddly. It can actually make that drawing process far more stressful than it should be. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this Spaniel tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week.